Now, the Model View Controller framework has been around for quite a while. It was first invented to create graphical user interfaces on most of your desktop applications. And it was a way to organize your code with a separation of concerns. Each file or piece of code was responsible for one thing. In this case, the model is responsible for all of the data and how the data acts. And in fact, the model should be able to live on its own, and then the view controller is just in charge of presenting the model to the user and responding to the user's actions. So you can take the same model and put a different view and controller on top of it, and you shouldn't have to edit your model file at all. So this is how we separate our concerns, or what each piece of code is responsible for. The model, of course, is responsible for the data. And when in a Ruby on Rails application, that means it's responsible for the database, writing the SQL, and also how objects act. For instance, if we have a user object that has a password, and we want to write a method that verifies that the password is correct, we would put that piece of code inside the model because that's how the user acts. And we verify his password that deals with the data. Now, the view in Ruby on Rails is going to be most of our HTML, and it is going to use a PHP-like language, except for it's going to be in Ruby, and it's actually called embedded Ruby or .erb. And so that language does allow us to do loops and make if statements inside of our HTML, but this is responsible for drawing up drawing up the HTML and sending it back to the user. Now the controller is basically the boss, and he is in charge of responding to the user's actions. So when the user clicks a link, there's going to be a router that decides what controller and what method inside of the controller gets called to respond to that link. And then the controller will contact the model and say, collect data out of it. So if we're presenting like all of the objects of our entity, that say we have a task entity, and the controller will ask the model for all of the tasks back. Or if we're going to create a task, the controller will tell the model to create a new task with the information that the user provided. If we're going to delete a task, the controller will tell the model to delete the task. Now, after the controller instructs the model to either give it information or update information that it stores, the controller will then choose which view to send back or what to send back to the user in response to his request. So it will choose, usually it will choose an HTML view and send that back to the user. It also might send back some JSON if we want a computer readable format or XML. But the controller is basically the man in charge. When a request comes in, it goes to the controller. The controller decides how he's going to interact with the model and tell the model to update or collect data from the model, and then he's going to decide which view to send back to the user. So this is how Rails works. When the user, using his web browser, clicks on a link or submits a form, the web browser submits an HTTP request over the network. Now that request has a URL that you can see in the address bar, and this is the domain name, but everything after the domain name is called the path. So if they click a link to see all the tasks, then the path will be /tasks. Now the router is located in the config folder, and it's called routes.rb. So using that code in there, it figures out it looks at the path and figures out which controller should respond to that request. And not only that, it figures out what method inside of the controller should respond to this request. So if we're getting all of our tasks out using this URL, we'll probably call the index method. Now that method will start off and it will ask the model to give all the tasks back to it. The model will write a SQL statement, query the database, and then create objects, one for each task. So it'll instantiate a task object for each task in the database, and then it will pass that array back to the controller. After the controller has all of the tasks, it will then choose a view, and by default, it uses the same name as the method. So if we're in the index method, it will choose the index view. The view will generate some HTML, and then that HTML will get sent back to the web browser over the internet, and we'll see a list of all of our tasks in our browser.